A very good morning to all of you. Welcome to this session. And today we have a galaxy of speakers. Our first speaker is here with us, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, sir. I'd like to just give a brief introduction about him. He's MBBS from UCMS and Safdarjung Hospital, New Delhi. MD Ophthalmology from AIMS, New Delhi, with a Cornea Fellowship at LV Prasad Eye Institute, Hyderabad. He's practicing at Gokhale Eye Hospital, Dadar West since 1995, and he's the third generation ophthalmologist at the Gokhale Eye Hospital with a keen interest in ocular surface infections and immunology. He has almost 30 peer-reviewed publications, both national and international, to his credit, with innumerable meeting presentations, and he's also the editorial board member of the Indian Journal of Ophthalmology. He's the reviewer in several national and international journals and the ex-president of the Cornea Society of India and ex-president of the Bombay Ophthalmologists Association. He's a brilliant surgeon and a great clinician. Welcome, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, sir, and eager to hear from you on corneal complications after cataract surgery. Over to you.
Thank you, Anaga. You can see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, okay. So welcome all and good morning. And basically, as a cornea specialist, we do see different types of complications following surgery, which are referred to us. So today I would concentrate on endothelial problems following cataract surgery, which basically I have experience in my practice. So the first issue that I would discuss is that when we have patients who had cataract surgery and come with post-cataract corneal edema, some of these could come immediate post-operatively. We could also have late corneal edema, which comes a few weeks after surgery, and then we could have edema which may come years after surgery. So I'll show you some cases that I've managed in my clinic and look at some diagnostic algorithms, how to treat these patients. Before we start, a little bit about physiology. In the normal cornea, there is the endothelial pump, which is very active. In patients with raised pressure, the pump is active, but you see epithelial edema. In patients with bullous keratopathy, where the pump fails, you will have corneal stromal and epithelial edema. And in patients where there is hypotony and the pump is inactive, you will just get stromal edema, but no epithelial edema. Keeping this in mind, if you have a patient who would walk into my clinic with a referral of early onset corneal edema, I normally try to look if it's a patient who has a diffusely hazy cornea, which looks mainly epithelial edema, I would consider raised intraocular pressure. Whereas a patient with no epithelial edema with a very hazy cornea, it could be a patient who has hypotony or wound leak. And another patient where there is a diffuse edema involving all the layers, I would also look for presence of inflammation, raised pressure, or a dilated pupil, which could suggest a toxic anterior segment syndrome. However, in the absence of this, it might indicate there is an endothelial injury. I normally look at the other eye. If the other eye shows a bad endothelium, probably this could be a response even following an uneventful cataract surgery. However, if the other eye is fairly normal, it indicates there has been some sort of endothelial trauma during surgery. And if the surgeon mentions that the surgery was uneventful, this could be something related to a toxic pathology. However, in presence of an eventful surgery like a hard cataract, small pupil, or a shallow AC, we can understand that there may have been endothelial problems during surgery. A Descemet membrane detachment can also present very similarly with diffuse edema. However, if the edema is localized to one area of the cornea, I would like to see whether the margins are distinct or indistinct. If the margins are indistinct, it indicates there is endothelial trauma. While if the margins are very sharp, it might signal a Descemet membrane detachment. So most cases of early edema we know resolve with medical management, and rarely surgical intervention is required. But one of this situation is a Descemet membrane detachment. I'll show you some cases of Descemet membrane detachment. So when you look very carefully at these cases, what you realize is that there is a very sharp distinction between the clear and the edematous cornea, a sharp margin, as I mentioned, which is very strongly suggestive and should make you suspect of a Descemet membrane detachment. If you cannot clinically pick up, you can do an OCT, which might help you to distinguish it. And a very important factor is to look whether these are planar detachments or non-planar. That means how much is the gap between the stroma, Descemet's, and the Descemet's membrane, and also look whether this is a detachment, whether it's a tear, whether it is scrolled or not scrolled, and what area is involved, and what is the size of the area of detachment. Based on these, one would determine how you would treat a patient with Descemet detachment. Depending if it's a large and total detachment, a non-expansile concentration of a gas air bubble would be the best. Similarly, if there is a edema which involves the central or the inferior cornea, gas bubble would be best. However, if you have superior detachment, an air bubble usually suffices to reattach the cornea. A small peripheral detachment or a very shallow detachment can be left alone because they may usually reattach on their own. Similarly, if you have a scroll tear in the periphery, it's best to observe them. A large central scroll tear is a very difficult situation, and in some situations, you might have to do an endothelial keratoplasty. Transcorneal suturing and EAC-TI are other modalities that might sometimes be required. Before we proceed further, seeing some of these cases, just to mention that we know the Descemet's is about 5 to 515 microns and an OCT, and consists of the anterior fetal layer, which remains constant with age, and the posterior non-banded layer, which thickens as we get older. And we have the interfacial matrix, which glues the Descemet's membrane to the corneal stroma. As we get older, the Descemet starts getting thicker, and patients with Fuchs dystrophy may have extremely thick Descemet's membrane, which can sort of also help you know, for example, if you have a patient with the Descemet membrane detachment, whether how is the Descemet's thickness. Now, why do we get a Descemet detachment? We know that the Descemet thickens with age. It becomes sort of still thicker in Fuchs dystrophy, and the adhesion between the stroma and the Descemet reduces with aging, and therefore whenever we have a knife which is blunt, it is more likely to push the Descemet's back rather than perforate or penetrate it. Similarly, while putting hydration, we can have a fluid wave which can detach the entire Descemet's, and movement of instruments across can cause tears and problems. We also have a very small subset of patients who can get bilateral Descemet membrane detachment following cataract surgery. And in these patients, there is possibly an inherent weakness of adhesion between the Descemet's and the stroma. And some of these can present even 2 to 4 weeks following an uneventful surgery. So the OCT not only helps us in documenting the Descemet membrane detachment, confirming the diagnosis, also helps us to understand the extent, configuration, and to know whether there is any tear or any loss of Descemet's membrane. And as I said, the thickness of Descemet's membrane can reflect whether the patient's endothelial status. Recently, a paper published by Dua et al. Showed us that the Descemet membrane detachment on OCT could be of 3 types, where you have the Descemet's and the Dua's layer detached, which is taut and tight. You can have a Descemet's alone, or you can have a splitting of the 2 layers. So this was one of the image I posted many years back in the Cornea Society, where I thought this was a splitting of the Descemet's membrane. So I'm not sure if this is splitting or this is really the Dua's layer. This is a patient where OCT was done and can show that the UBM also showed that there is a significant loss of Descemet's membrane in the central cornea. However, we still went and put an air bubble, because if the peripheral or the mid-peripheral corneal endothelial reserve is good, these patients can clear up. So despite loss of a large area of central Descemet's, the cornea can clear up. So do treat these patients even if they look bad to begin with. This was a case where there was a viscoelastic which was injected for doing capsulorhexis, resulted in a Descemet detachment total, and the Descemet's is seen sticking to the lens. With some experience of EK, I did a double full thickness tab incisions. The viscoelastic was very slowly expressed, and a gas bubble was put, and the Descemet's reattached eventually. Sometimes you might need to put transcorneal full thickness sutures in some difficult cases which fail bubbling once or twice. And you may also have patients where there are adhesions where you need to roll and release them before you inject a gas bubble to make the Descemet supple and reattach. And sometimes you can have Descemet scroll like this right in the center, causing some decrease in vision, but the cornea is now crystal clear, and you have to accept the situation. Sometimes when you have a total Descemet detachment, I do an inferior EAC-TI so that I can put a large gas bubble and don't get pupillary block. And miraculously, in some few patients, I've had the Descemet reattached when I called them for the gas bubble injection. Tractional Descemet detachment is not common with cataract surgery, but you can get it in very inflamed eyes. And sometimes we have a situation where we have synechia to deal during surgery. So if you have thick synechia with a lot of fibrosis, it's better to cut it rather than try to separate them, which may cause a Descemet membrane detachment. One of the problems with injecting air and gas bubbles are that the hydrophilic lenses can opacify following these procedures and can be a big problem after, once they cause visual loss. Another problem which might happen for early corneal edema is toxic anterior segment syndrome. While it's most common with chemical residue and enzymatic cleaners with various fluids and medications that we use during surgery, a new problem is because of use of intracameral antibiotics. Either they are not mixed properly, or they may be having additives which are not safe for the corneal endothelium and the uveal tissue, and you get severe inflammation. I would now share with you some cases of late onset post-operative corneal edema. So let's see if we have a late onset edema, how would you manage these cases? If the corneal edema mainly involves the inferior cornea, one should think of a retained fragment of the nucleus, the epinucleus or the intraocular lens. However, in patients who have old corneal pathology, you know their cell counts were low when you operated. It could be a slowly progressive corneal edema picture. Patients who have had chronic inflammation, or they had a complicated surgery, either because of a poorly placed lens, or they have vitreous disturbance, or they have a sort of glaucoma with chronic inflammation. So these are patients where they might slowly come down over a period of time with progressive cell loss. Now, if they started with a low cell density preoperatively, they may come in the early postoperative period. However, if they started with a very good cell density, they might present as a late onset bullous keratopathy years after surgery. A sudden onset of corneal edema and keratinic precipitates after uneventful cataract surgery should also one consider viral endothelitis, because they respond very well to antiviral plus steroid. However, if the condition continues to recur and is refractory to steroids, or recurrence is there, one should always rule out a low-grade endophthalmitis like a P. acne endophthalmitis in these patients. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also have late onset Descemet detachment in some of these patients. A very rare cause of late onset peripheral edema is the Brown-McLean syndrome. So I'll show you a few cases in practice. A retained lens fragment, you need to have a high index of suspicion. They do well in the early few weeks, but then start getting recurrent inflammation, raised pressure. And if in doubt, do gonioscopy, slit lamp examination, UBM and OCT, and you need to remove them as early as possible. UBM has the advantage of showing you not only the fragment, but also the mobility of the fragment. Similarly, you can get, like this patient had an intraocular lens fragment or a loop fragment, which was left behind following an IOL exchange. And we floated the fragment out, and the patient recovered with a clear cornea because we intervened early. However, if you wait, you are going to get failure. This was an unusual patient who had an iris coloboma, was referred. I saw a Descemet scroll at 6 o'clock with inferior corneal edema. I expected him to recover spontaneously. However, on follow-up, he continued to get worse and the edema continued to progress. The Descemet scroll appeared fixed on slit lamp examination at 6 o'clock. But it was only subsequently when I did a UBM, I realized that this was a floating Descemet scroll. So I had to take him into operation theater and remove the Descemet scroll. I did a little bit of anterior stromal puncture. And this is how he looked 3 months after surgery. His cornea has recovered and he's extremely happy. And as I mentioned, always consider a P. acne endophthalmitis when you have something which looks a little unusual. Brown-McLean syndrome is a very specific entity which can come after any form of cataract surgery. Originally, it was after intracapsular cataract extraction, where you get peripheral corneal edema, pigment dusting on the endothelium. The central cornea is spared for many years, and very often you can get away without doing a surgery in these patients. The etiology is still not very clear. And therefore, it's very important that you want to avoid all these situations. We need to evaluate the endothelium well preoperatively. A good slit lamp is essential to not only look at guttate changes, Descemet thickening, and pigment dispersion on the endothelium. We also need to learn the specular technique of slit lamp examination. Although we may have a specular microscope, we need to look at guttate changes, which are excrescences on the Descemet membrane. We need to understand that specular microscopy is often not helpful when you need it the most. So if you just look at the cell count, it can be erroneous, especially in patients with bad endothelium. And you need to look at the hexagonality, the coefficient of variation, and the presence of guttate changes, and not just the cell density, because it can mislead us totally. And unfortunately, in most patients with endothelial dystrophy, you don't get proper images and you cannot make a judgment. And therefore, the judgment is often clinical. So if you have a patient who has no epithelial edema, the pachymetry is less than 600. Pachymetry profile is normal. There is no history of morning blurring of vision. You could go ahead with doing a cataract surgery alone. Whereas if you have frank epithelial edema, you have a thick cornea and an abnormal pachymetry profile, possibly do a combined surgery. Understand that guttata itself can cause 1 or 2 lines of drop of visual acuity, and eyes with very poor endothelium are best left unless the cataract is really severe and there is significant visual loss. Dr. Sanjay Patel showed us that tomography can be a very good tool to pick up a very subclinical stromal edema and make a better decision of whether we do a triple procedure or we do a cataract alone. And we also have situations where it's very difficult to clinically distinguish whether we are looking at a patient who's got Fuchs dystrophy or whether we are looking at a patient who's got viral disease, because they may both present with corneal edema. However, in viral disease, we know there will be a history of red eye, there may be a history of recurrent eye problems, there will be keratic precipitates, there may be some subtle corneal scars, and the response to steroids and antivirals in a patient who has viral disease will help us to distinguish, because in Fuchs dystrophy, we don't expect any response to antiviral therapy. And the presence of iridocyclitis with a dull sensation will further strengthen our thought process regarding a viral etiology. So when we look at all these features, sometimes in unilateral situations, it helps us to distinguish what we are treating and make a better decision. So I would thank Ajanta Pharma and the All India Ophthalmic Society for giving me this opportunity to be here today to show you some of my cases of endothelial dystrophy. And I would like to say that please stay safe and take care. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, sir. That was a wonderful presentation and an excellent overview of all the cases of how we could, come up with good algorithms and lines of management for all these patients. I'd like to ask you a question. The case that you showed where you had an inferior YAG-PI that was done, and you mentioned that that probably was miraculously curative. I just wanted to know what was the case and how it helped in reducing the DMD.
So we have had 3 patients like this, where I have had 3 patients where there was a total Descemet detachment, and I thought that I'll have to put an extremely large bubble or a full chamber bubble, and to make a surgical PI was difficult to throw because it may cause bleeding and other things. So I tried to make a very small YAG PI inferiorly through whatever clear zone was there. And subsequently, normally I call the patient after 3 or 4 days for the gas bubble injection when I found that the Descemets had started to reattach. So I've discussed this with several clinicians and my seniors. Though we don't have a clear mechanism, they felt that maybe the rise in intraocular pressure with the pigment dispersion or the release of pigment into the anterior chamber may have caused some sort of an inflammatory response, which is either plugged the aqueous flow or has caused in some way the reattachment. We still don't know. It's not published. It is not reported in literature, but I have these type of cases which are intriguing. So
it was a very interesting situation, and I was also wondering maybe the amount of fluid that comes out from the posterior to the anterior chamber, but that would not be as much as to really actually.
So we really don't know, but it has happened on several occasions. So there is something going on which we cannot clearly explain.
Right, very interesting. One more question I wanted to ask you was regarding patients with chronic, long-standing, and uncontrolled diabetes. We all know that these patients are more at risk of developing all these corneal decompensation. What is your thoughts on it, and anything specific, the message that we want to give to the audience is in these patients, subset of patients, what extra precautions would you do?
So I think the diabetic cornea behaves very differently than normal corneas, right from epithelium, the loss of subbasal nerve plexus, and as well as the endothelial changes are well documented, that they may have lower endothelial counts, they may have good endothelial count, but the cells may not be functioning to their full capacity. Like I mentioned, we could, although the count may be normal, the function may not be all that great. And therefore, in all these patients, we need to take extra precautions when we do a cataract surgery. If possible, do a specular count if there is any suspicion of having some sort of endothelial pathology in these patients, and therefore be more careful, I think.
Right. Thank you so much. And one last question is, what is the indication of specular biomicroscopy in high-risk patients like a hard brown cataract, like diabetic, like you mentioned? Obviously, in a fuchs patient, we would do it. But in a routine cataract patient, if you think it's a small pupil or this thing, we usually do it. So what is your take on it?
I totally agree, because I think when we have difficult cases, I would always suggest or recommend that we do cell counts. Also because we have some patients with very low cell counts, but no gutted changes. Corneas may look very clear, but you have a cell count of 1500, and post-operatively, then you realize that you have had a complication. So I think it's very important to do a cell count in these patients, and actually doing a cell count pre and post operatively has also helped me understand that some of these cases I managed to do a phaco, I managed to get a clear cornea, but I had destroyed maybe a very large percentage of cells. And maybe for the future surgeries in these type of cases, I have been more careful, use better viscoelastic, or then change and do a small incision surgery if my phaco was not, I was not very confident. So I think we have to learn from doing not only pre-op counts but also post-op counts, which also help us to educate us as to what we are doing during surgery.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great insights and nice learning from all this. Thank you so much, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale.
Yeah, I think so. Now we'll have Dr. Anuga, who's going to talk to us today. We all know Dr. Anuga Herur works in Dombivli. She's in charge of the hospital at Dombivli. She has a big practice in Mumbai, in Thane district, and she is basically a member of the ARC committee, West Zone AIOS. She is also the scientific committee and zonal member of the Maharashtra Ophthalmological Society. She is member of the managing committee of the BOA, and she is an executive committee member of the IIRSI. She is a co-editor of the AIOS newsletter. She has done her education in Sion Hospital, right from her MBBS to MS, and also her DNB. And she has been a topper and a top graduate at all the exams that she has gone through. She has had, we all know, she has had several national as well as international presentations in meetings, and she has had several awards, right from video awards to surgical awards to awards for her scientific presentations, not only at national level, but also at several states across the country. And I would now invite Anaga, who is a very close friend and a very active member of BOA, to share her talk on dry eye in today's scenario. Welcome, Dr. Anaga, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nikhil sir, for the kind introduction. Thank you so much. And at the outset, I'd also like to thank AIOS and Ajanta Pharma for this opportunity. And this is a very different topic that we would be speaking today on, the dry eye practice in today's scenario. Are my slides visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So this was the headline in one of the leading dailies in 2019. India on the brink of a dry eye disease epidemic, said the study. And what it said was age, urban residence, occupation, and socio-economic affluence were among the risk factors. It predicted a prevalence of almost 40% of dry eye by 2030 in urban population. And this was carried out across India, and the results were published in the Ocular Surface. Now, we all know a lot of risk factors for dry eye disease, including contact lens wear, smoking, exposure to digital devices, and air pollution, and so many other reasons. Now, a fast track to June 2021, and this is the changed headline: Indians suffered maximum damage to eyesight, and this is what the corona pandemic has done, and it has increased the toll on the eyes, especially with regard to dry eye disease. A very interesting nomenclature was here published in this article called as the quarantine dry eye, which basically gave us the implications of the lockdown in the COVID-19 disease and its implications on ocular surface health. Now, during the corona pandemic, a big global change that has occurred is a series of containment measures and lockdowns, curfews, stay-at-home orders all over the globe. Now, this global lockdown has ensured that around 3.9 billion people worldwide, which went under lockdown, and the entire world was suddenly changed into a virtual world. So there was temporary closure of schools, universities, colleges, offices, and industries worldwide. So now what is the connection with dry eye? Let us see how this has increased the predisposition and risk factors for a dry eye disease. Now we also have today, because of the disease pandemic, environmental changes, modifications in personal behavior, abuse of digital devices, malnutrition including vitamin deficiencies and essential fatty acids, sleep and psychiatric disorders, and mask associated dry eye. And one interesting syndrome is the sick building syndrome when you're confined to your house. So when we're talking about the quarantine dry eye, it's basically a new phenomenon which has suddenly caused an increase in the number of dry eye patients all over the world, and probably because of restrictive measures that could be recursively extended over time, considering the third wave or the fourth wave that could be possible in the next few months. We all need to be very wary of this situation. Already in my practice, I have seen a huge increase in the symptomatology of dry eye in patients across ages. Now, what has significantly increased is the use of video display terminals. It's basically a new lifestyle, not only for adults who started working from home, but also for the school children, where there are online classes, and college going students. There is basically prolonged near work, and this has increased the predisposition to ocular surface disorders. This was an article which showed an interesting a statistic which showed that the use of PCs, smartphones, tablets has increased by a whopping 300%. And this increase of screens probably has exacerbated the increase in the dry eye disease. Now, how this has done is basically because of the reduced blink rate, incomplete blinking, which we all know increases evaporative dry eye. The prevalence of dry eye has also been seen very high in the pediatric age group. Now, in this age group, had been relatively, safe from the dry eye, and we always had thought that dry eye is something which is basically to with respect to the postmenopausal females with diabetics and thyroid disorders. But the corona pandemic has shown us that even in the pediatric age group, especially with increased use of smartphone in urban areas, and the reduction in the outdoor activity has increased the prevalence of dry eye disease. Now, this was a study that was published by Dr. Titial sir et al., which showed that the prevalence of dry eye disease in North India is as high as 32%, and the exposure to video display terminals, smoking, and contact lens use were the greater risk factors. Now, because of work from home and a constant connect with technology, even though you're at home, this has given rise to what is called as probably the office eye syndrome, where there's more of sedentary behavior. You're not allowed to go out. There's reduction in physical activity. You're not going out for walks or even exercising. So basically a sedentary behavior which has increased, and exposure to low humidity, air conditioned environments throughout the day, which probably has increased the exposure to dry air and then causing a change in the tear film because of an evaporation of the aqueous layer. Now let's look at what are the dietary implications of the COVID times and its relation to dry eye disease. There has been a significant change in the eating and drinking habits secondary to lockdown. Now, not only there is closing of the restaurants outside, but more time spent at home and more time spent not only preparing and cooking and eating, probably in order to improve our feel good factor, there is probably a greater tendency towards more of fast food. And also this could cause main nutritional deficiencies associated with dry eye, especially with respect to lack of vitamin A, vitamin D, and essential fatty acids. So if there's a diet which is poor in vegetables, fruits, low intake of vitamins and antioxidants, along with a reduced physical activity, could push a patient towards dry eye. Also, probably because of the lockdown, inadequate availability of fresh ingredients could probably increase the use of frozen foods, which are lower in nutrition. Also, because of the lockdown, there has been a disruption of the work routine, more of boredom, and probably becoming a couch potato. And this causes more of increase in macronutrients, increase in intake of carbohydrates, and this has a greater tendency to develop obesity. Now, basically, how obesity acts is basically it's a chronic state of inflammation which has nutritional deficiencies, and plus because of binge eating and because of eating fast food, there could be dehydration, and all this could increase in the amount of dry eye disease also. Also, lockdown related emotional stress, psychiatric problems could worsen the kind of the psychiatric behavior, and the increase in food intake secondary to these emotional tensions could also increase the amount of sugar rich food that are increased and causing dehydration and as well as nutritional deficiencies. Probably a greater increase in alcohol consumption has also been seen in this period, especially because of social isolation and economic uncertainty, and patients going into depression and negative reinforcement in order to escape stress. And recent studies have shown that alcohol consumption may be a significant risk factor for dry eye. So when it comes to sleep and psychiatric disorders, all of us know that because there is no specific work routine, there has been a disruption of the sleep cycle also. Again, uncertainty related to the pandemic because of fear, anxiety, worry, stress has seen an increase in depression, especially in the US, where it was found to be threefold higher during the pandemic than it was earlier. Also, it has pushed people into probably substance abuse and elevated suicidal tendencies. A lot of ophthalmologists also, especially younger ophthalmologists or people who have just started practice and who have been suffering a lot of economic burden and financial crisis, have been pushed into anxiety and depression. How this affects probably dry eyes, an increase in the amount of neurological and psychiatric medications, which could act as a risk factor for developing dry eye. Again, disrupted sleep rhythms and insomnia can disrupt the lacrimal system. Increased exposure because people keep hooked on to their mobiles or laptops or the television. So increase in the exposure to blue light causes a melatonin change in the cycle and the cycle of sleep disruption, which increases the amount of eye fatigue. A very specific kind of problem here is the mask associated dry eye. This was an interesting article in the IJO where they said there was a mask associated dry eye disease could be probably a dry eye epidemic during the COVID-19 era. This was another article which said the self-reported symptoms of mask-associated dry eye in a survey study of almost 3,600 people, and it was found that there was a marked increase in dry eye symptoms among regular mask users. Now, one of the important reasons is because there is a space between the edge of the mask and the face, the air from the breathing, that is when we are breathing out, could be channeled up on top of the face mask and over the surface of the eye, causing tear evaporation and leaving the surface dry. So probably taping the mask at the edge on the top of the mask could help, and also patients being counseled regarding it and regular monitoring of these patients. So lubrication and lubricating eye drops and using a very well-fitting mask could probably be one of the solutions, and limited time in air-conditioned environments, and basically explaining to the patients the possible problems due to long-term mask wear, though that is the most important way of how we can prevent COVID-19 infection from spreading. So basically what we need to do is an early and timely detection by identifying those who are at risk, screening these patients, counseling them, and then treating them at the right time. So what our goal should be is to reduce the emergence of risk factors as far as possible, reduce the prevalence of complications and disability. So we need to target these populations who are susceptible and pick them up early, even if they are asymptomatic. And those who are symptomatic, definitely screen them and treat them accordingly. So what we are doing in our clinic is basically all those patients who are symptomatic with dry eye symptoms, we are exposing them and doing dry eye protocol for these patients to look for evidence and signs of dry eye, especially with regard to evaporative dry eye and MGD. Those patients who are at high risk, like diabetics, thyroid disorders, postmenopausal females, those who are going to be operated for refractive surgeries and cataract surgery, especially the premium multifocal and the toric IOLs, glaucoma patients who are under chronic anti-glaucoma medications, contact lens users, and those who are exposed to digital devices for more than 2 hours per day are the special subset of patients who should be screened for dry eye disease. So basic dry eye protocol has to be done by all of us as ophthalmologists, like doing an OSDI score or any kind of scoring system that you can do, and then compare it pre and post treatment, a tear breakup time, Schirmer's test, and a myography, just to begin with. Education of the patient regarding changes that they can do in their routine homes and when they are working on their PCs, laptops, should be explained to the patient, especially like the 20-20-20 rule, or adequate and complete blinking, use of lubricant eye drops, keeping a good posture, and how they need to keep the proper distance from the PCs has to be explained to the patient. Now, all those patients also who are continuously using mobiles, because mobiles is one of the important digital devices people are using even for their businesses, has to be explained how they can change the screen tone and the display, how they can improve their screen brightness, adjust it according to the level of the room light, improve the contrast as much as possible, however, reducing the eye strain, also using humidifiers for dry and warmer rooms. Now, when we are following the TFOS guidelines, for these patients, remember, of all these asymptomatic patients also, if they have risk factors, look for signs. If there are signs, then they need to be explained regarding what are the environmental modifications they can do. In those patients who are symptomatic and also who have signs, definitely treat them according to whether they are evaporative or aqueous deficient dry eye. And if there are no signs at present, keep looking for them, and then also offer education and preventative therapy. Now, once they are identified in the OPD, go ahead with triaging questions, look for any other risk factors, like, for example, any systemic risk factors, and then refer them to a rheumatologist for further treatment and management. Depending on the risk factor analysis and the symptomatology, various other tests like the tear breakup time or the osmolarity, the ocular surface staining, divide them between the evaporative and aqueous deficiency dry eye, grade them according to the severity, and then depending on the severity also start the proper treatment in the form of tear substitutes, especially the non-preserved ocular lubricants, and the overnight ointments, and probably very low anti-inflammatories like low steroids or cyclosporin, or even the higher treatments like the expression of meibomian glands, intense pulse light therapies, or the LipiFlow for MGD. Now, basically, there could also be, due to COVID times, a greater financial burden of therapy on these patients with respect to buying the over-the-top medications for lubricants, and this has to be continued for a longer time. Increasing costs due to therapies like the IPL and the LipiFlow may prevent them from taking this treatment, and that is why they need to be counseled regarding that. So, to conclude, what we need to do and what has changed in my practice over the last many months after the onset of the corona pandemic is basically we are monitoring closely various age groups for dry eye disease. So it's not just the higher age groups that we were seeing earlier, but even children, young adults, or those who are computer users for a prolonged period of time throughout the day. This quarantine dry eye is probably likely to reduce the quality of life in all these patients, and drastic reduction in the work and school efficiency could be one of the things that we might see in the time to come till the corona pandemic actually leaves us. So for all these patients, timely diagnosis and timely treatment may promptly help us to limit all these problems. Thank you so much for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Over to you, Rohit, sir.
Okay.
Very good morning,
Morning, ma'am. Ma'am.
How are you? So sorry, I couldn't take your call. I was just...
No problem, man. Just share the screen.
Yeah, I'll just introduce Dr. Rohit Shetty, sir. We are so honored, sir, to have you here with us. Dr. Rohit Shetty, sir, needs no introduction, but I would still like to give a brief overview. Dr. Rohit Shetty, sir, is a cornea refractive surgeon and a clinician scientist with a keen interest in keratoconus and corneal ectatic disorders. He's completed his residency in ophthalmology at the St. John's Medical College for the Diplomate of National Board. He obtained his FRCS Glasgow, Scotland, UK in 2006 and is currently an FRCS examiner. He's the chief mentor for the dual academic program, PhD and clinical fellowship at Narayan Nethralaya Eye Institute, Bangalore, and the Maastricht University. He has over 200 publications in peer-reviewed journals and also on the editorial board of the Journal of Refractive Surgery Systems. In the 2015 annual conference of the AIOS, he won the prestigious Colonel Rangachari Award for the overall best paper of the conference for his work on is inflammation driving keratoconus. The American Academy of Ophthalmology recently conferred an achievement award to Dr. Rohit Shetty sir for his distinguished services that he has rendered over the years to the programs of the society. He was also awarded the Casimir Award for outstanding contribution to refractive surgery by the ISRS in 2019. Looking forward to your talk, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, AIOS and the Ajanta for organizing this. My talk is about cells, COVID care, and personalized medicine. These are my financial interests. So one of the things we did last year was publish a few papers on COVID-related work. And one of this was a hypothetical-based review of COVID prophylaxis for healthcare professionals. We used this concept because of Trehalose, because we found out from the other part of the body, from the medicine, it does a lot of antiviral activities. And because it had a lot of antiviral activities itself, we thought that why not use this as one of the areas of prophylaxis. I'll just go into this here. And this is how a virus enters. This is a paper in the early part of the epidemic, last, I think it was published in June or July, very early. And it was a very interesting paper about how the COVID cells enters through the ACE2 receptors. I want you to remember this picture for in your mind because I'm going to use a lot of things related to this image over time when I keep speaking. And there is a pathway where, cathepsin-induced endocytosis, which is a very important thing. That's how the virus enters. It binds to the receptors, use this particular enzyme, and then it gets into the cell, and then it starts replicating, creating your RNAs, and then all that controls your body. This can happen in any cell. It can happen in your cornea. It can happen in any part of your body or lung epithelial cells, depending on the receptors which it needs to enter. So there are two important things at that point of time, the chloroquine and Trehalose, because something it was easily available. And you can see here that in many parts, it reduces the cathepsin pathway. It reduces this related pathway. This is what we believe in. And also it helps in, degrade the enzymes. And all this helps in reducing the viral load and doesn't allow it to replicate at all. And this is a picture about how chloroquine and both Trehalose work on the epithelial cells. This is nothing to do with COVID, but in a regular dry eye kind of a picture here. So the first question, that was the first thing, which was more of an hypothesis at that point of time. We didn't have access to the COVID eyeballs. Unfortunately, the second wave got in a lot of new challenges. One of the challenges was the eye bank challenge. We used to get eyes from patients who had no history of COVID but had a silent MI, and the physicians had not done COVID tests because it just looked like MI. However, we are one of the few eye banks in the country where we used to take the swab, and having our own COVID testing laboratory, we could come and get the swab of this test person for the checking of COVID status. And we would keep the eyes for 24 to 48 hours till the report comes. And we were surprised, out of say 100 eyes we collected, close to 20% of them were unknown COVID positive patients. And if we had not done the COVID testing, these corneas would have gone to somebody and they would start using it. However, with the ethics committee clearance and all the other regulatory body clearance, we thought, why not use this COVID eye to see how the gene expression, how the response of the ACE2 receptors, everything we wanted to study at the microcellular level. These are one of the very, very few there's not much of work that really happened on this project yet. And we are one of the few and fortunate to be able to do this, to come to the scientific community, what we really plan to do with this data. And we looked at gene expressions, we looked at the receptors, which helps to enter the eyes. I'm not going to too deep into this. Look at these ACE2 receptors, TIMPRESS, CTL, all these catapsin-based pathways. These are all important ones. These are in the healthy eyes. You can see those green ones. These are all your receptors. We can, it's all labeled. Also, we looked at from cornea, conjunctiva, trabecular meshwork, choroid, and each and every layer. At this point of time, my colleagues, Dr. Sharon, Gairek, Pooja, and Purnachandra, Tirumalesh, all of them were very, very instrumental in this whole project. It's one of the very, very important projects because dissecting it out, getting these eyes, trying to get this organized and sending it immediately to the lab for all the staining was very important. So what we found was, this was a control eye. We found that the retina did not show much of ACE2 receptors. So that means the chance of virus going directly into the retina and attaching itself was very low. The conjunctiva and cornea, especially the ocular surface, had a very high level of these receptors, something similar to what you see in lungs, which means that we are filled with it. And you can see that these red are those receptors. And we also stained for the antiviral staining. And these viral interferons, these interferons are the ones who actually kill or reduce the viral load, which you see completely is absent in a COVID positive eye. And in the COVID recovered eye, it's relatively better. But you can see that the conjunctiva is one area where the receptors are heavy. And even in your cornea also, you can see that it is there, but as not as much as what you see in the conjunctiva. And this is a very important feature of the antiviral activity, which controls the role of how the viral will replicate, but it's completely absent or low in the COVID positive eye. And you can see that there are also which stain with all the TIMPRESS and in the stroma and the recovered eyes. They were not the real important factor at this point of time, but when you look at the catapsin, the one which I showed you, this is the one which is catapsin here. If you remember this thing, catapsin-based thing, we also stained for this. And what we see in it is exhibit immense catapsin in epithelium while experience limited in the control and recovered. That means that catapsin, which is the green here, is extremely localized. It's very high in this zone, and you don't see it in the recovered eyes, and you don't see too much of this on a healthy eye. So what is important here is there is a mechanism of the COVID virus entering into the eye, exactly like what we have seen in the picture here, which was at that point of time last year, a diagrammatic picture. This was taken from different, it was adapted from a nature, and we adapted to our localized, to the corneal part of it, the ocular surface part of it, but exactly what we saw a year later with these eyeballs, which is quite interesting and also scary at the point that these cells are changing. Both in the control eyes is different. Of course, we don't expect them. The COVID positive eyes is different. You can see that even in the cornea, and the recovered eyes is completely different because it's changed. It behaves something similar to the control. This is how beautifully the cells are behaving. And these positive eyes are not the patients where we got the eyes from the ICU or we did not touch. They were more of an asymptomatic positive. That means they didn't even know that they were positive. And that is what is very important at this point of time. And we started looking at potential therapeutic targets. We looked at trehalose and chloroquine. And what we found was these were on the HCE12. The trehalose activity increased the antiviral change. I've not put this picture, and this is a very, very important factor out here because antiviral activity is this. I'm sorry, my slide is filled with all these diagrams, but if you look at this in the control eye, and you can, a little bit of this is here, not too much. This is what we need to increase. And that is what increased with the trehalose. And that is why we've been telling, even last year, at this point of time, exactly what does it do? It reduces the catapsin, increases your interferons. And this is what we want to express here, with this experiment, this is one of the world's first time we're going to show this, that we're just ready to send it for a Nature journal, one of the important journals, is that this is the increase, this increase of the interferons is what is very important with trehalose. The second point, madam has already covered this, but we did some experiment. What she spoke about the mask is very right. It's about the hypercapnia, and hypercapnia changes everything. We did a study with the tears collected before the COVID started and after we put the mask. And I'll just go directly. What it happens is the hypercapnia changes the entire ocular surface in a different way. Hypercapnia is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is not supposed to be pumped in all the time. If you wear a mask which is loose, it goes up. And what is important is the mask-related dry eye is completely different. And you have patients who complain for very vague symptoms because your molecular pathways are completely vague. And that is why patients who come with mask, even though they say they don't wear mask for a long time, still you have a vague symptom because this can change. Because all the time we are used to looking at hyperosmolality. But what I want to tell you here is mask-induced dry eye induce hypo. Remember this, it's hypo, not hyper, which we are already used. So drugs which work on hyperosmolality dry eye should not probably be used. We should look at drugs which are, I don't even look at, drugs which are the older generation one, which are not a hyperosmolality reducing drugs, is something which would work very well out this year. So what I'm to say is you can expect delayed wound healing because of hypercapnia and this non-responders to treatment, different type of bacteria, because bacteria which are anaerobic and aerobic are completely different, because bacteria, you will end up in having bacteria who can survive without oxygen and probably survive with carbon dioxide. Different inflammatory markers, the corneal nerves are changing, and ocular discomfort will be completely different from what we know. And if you are a keratoconus, we're already seeing this. There's a lot of changes in the way keratoconus progress because of the change in the ocular surface milieu. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. And I would like to end my slides here.
Thank you so much, sir. That was a lovely presentation, sir. And great insights. We admire and respect Narayan Netralaya for doing such cutting edge research and giving all of us insights into so many new things. And these are path breaking things and changes of how a dry eye due to mask is so different from a routine dry eye, something which is really very, very new and different. Thank you so much, sir, for such an insightful presentation.
Thank you, ma'am.
I wanted to ask you, sir, in your practice, what difference have you found in the last 1 year or in the last few months post-COVID compared to what it was before the corona pandemic?
A lot of things, because what I see is a lot of people who come back to you with dryness or ocular surface change are not the same as before. They're just not dryness. They have a lot of internal component like accommodative component involved in it. This is where, we have to look at dryness, not just as in treating the drugs, but in a different way. Most of this dryness patient need addition of cyclosporin or one of the immunomodulators, because it's heavily immune driven. Because every time you wear a mask which is loose, you mentioned, you breathe in, breathe out, and that changes everything. The third is be specific about what lubricant you use, because lubricants which actually reduces the hyperosmolality would induce more of a problem according to this experiment, because you already have hypoosmolality. Your Schirmer's and T-buds will be normal because hypercapnia actually increases your Schirmer's and actually increases your T-buds sometime, because you bring in more mucin. So you have to be very careful about changes. So all our parameters which we are used to has to be relooked at it in a different way. So you have to treat the symptoms, not the signs here.
Okay, which diagnostic modality then would you rely on, sir? Because then there would be a great, difference
Symptoms.
in the correlation between signs and symptoms.
Symptoms. Just at this point of time, I rely more on symptoms. And anytime you do a cataract or a refractive on these patients who wear this mask for a longer time, be aware that especially doctors, post-operative LASIK patients always end up with hyperinflammation. Many of them come with a lot of cells, sands of Sahara type of picture. So be very careful, because Many doctors I operated in the recent past do have some kind of a sterile infiltrate, which I never seen in the past, and nurses. So what that means that your ocular flora has changed, because the ocular flora changes with the kind of oxygen or no oxygen. So all that will change. So you're healing over time. You do a cataract, a patient wear mask, the same person who would normally heal the epithelium in this person would be different healing. So just don't look at dry eye only as a factor. Look at every single thing which is going to happen. Take it in a different light, because with mask, you're going to have a completely different picture.
Are you pre-treating with, say, cyclosporin in all these patients?
No, I don't.
Especially pre-refractive surgery?
No, this, you can use like Trehalose base, like I said, in this COVID time, I used to use it when the last year, when I used to go to OT, because, and this, what I just showed you today, clearly showing the world's first report on this. We're just going to submit this, how a prophylaxis in the ocular surface can increase a change on bringing in more interferons and bringing in more antiviral activity.
That's a great take-home message, sir.
And if you are looking, I used to use it, and a lot of people at that point of time, see, people, if you don't have proof, sometimes very difficult to, to represent something. At that point of time, I didn't have access to COVID. These were not COVID patients in ICU. That's very interesting. They died of MI. They died of just silent death. 60-year-old, no, he died yesterday silently in bed. It was silent MI. We didn't do COVID because we don't know it's COVID. We take a swab. All of them are COVID. So it is a very important point to be taken across. And Ajanta, I know financial interest, but I like they bought this Hypocillin cleaning cleansers. And this is a very important thing, because I used to use it a lot during the time, because we need to bring in flora. We need to, we need to take the ocular surface out. This is scary, even though it's scientifically interesting, it's very scary thought to have the virus growing in your conjunctiva. It's also scary thought if you are doing a cataract surgery and if you are operating and without doing a test and the patient is asymptomatic, you don't know he may be carrying. Out of the 100 eyes we collected of deaths, 20 to 28 of them actually were, and imagine a lot of eye banks are not doing it. I've been telling everybody, please do it, even though it costs you more, because you may be collecting it and the same thing, the same eyeball which has all this goes to a person. Imagine the virus may replicate.
Yes, yes.
That is how you have different strains now, beta, theta, and all. Because they replicate slowly. So my take-home point is there is proof of what is happening. I wish I had some financial interest in all these drugs I'm mentioning, but I don't. And but still, I used to use a lot of them on myself because I believed in it, and now we have the proof. There's nothing more beautiful than having a proof.
Right. Great cutting-edge research, and thank you so much, sir, for being here today.
Thank you, ma'am. I had to go to one more session. Thank you.
Sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Do we have Dr. Jodhbir Mehta sir's video to be played?
Yes, ma'am. AV team, please play video.
Yeah, I would be just giving a brief introduction about him. We are actually honored to have Dr. Jodhbir Mehta sir's video being presented here. Unfortunately, he could not join us personally. He is a senior consultant at the Singapore National Eye Center. Its specialty in corneal and external eye disease, cataract and comprehensive ophthalmology and refractive surgery. He is graduated from Guy's and St. Thomas's Medical School, University of London, UK in 1995. He did his basic and advanced specialist training at Moorfields Eye Hospital, UK. Dr. Jodhbir Mehta, Professor Sir, is an adjunct associate professor at Department of Ophthalmology, Yong Loo Lin School of Medicine, National University of Singapore. Is the Board of Directors of Corneal Society USA, Fellow Royal Society of Medicine, Member Executive Committee, International Society of Refractive Surgeons, ISRS, Animals in Research Committee, the Association for Research in Vision and Ophthalmology, ARVO. And he has also got a lot of awards like the Costa Lecture, Australia and New Zealand Cornea Society, He's received the Gold Medal International Intraocular Implant and Refractive Society of India in 2017, a Senior Achievement Award from the American Academy of Ophthalmology in 2017, the best paper session of the with the femtosecond laser-assisted pterygium surgery by the American Society of Cataract and Refractive Surgeons in 2017, and the Mahatma Gandhi Sanman Award by the NRI Welfare Society of India in 2017. So, waiting to listen to your video, sir.
Please play the video.
Yeah, it's not playing. We can only see the first. The video is not playing. Please start it.
So I'd like to thank the organizing committee for the kind invitation to talk. So over the last decade, we've seen a revolution in corneal endothelial transplantation surgery, and DMEC is really the ultimate form of endothelial reconstruction.
Increase the volume.
Yes, please increase the volume. We cannot hear the audio. Please start the audio and the video, please. The video has stopped. Please start the video and the audio.
Yes, ma'am.
It's been shown to have better visual acuity outcomes and lower rejection rate and less rates of glaucoma compared to previous surgical procedures. However, it does require a considerable level of expertise in surgery. You do need to have good quality
The video has stopped. We cannot see or hear. Please check.
Yes, ma'am, it is working on.
donor tissue, and only 1 in 70 of the needs are covered.
I think there is some issue with the playing of the video. So we are so sorry that we are not able to play the video. And thank you so much, AIOS, and thank you so much, Ajanta Pharma, for contributing to the scientific sessions in the AIOS. Thank you so much for this session. Thank you all. Thank you also, Dr. Rohit Shetty, sir, Dr. Nikhil Gokhale, sir, and Professor Jodhbir Mehta for sending the video. Unfortunately, we are not able to play it here. And there's some problem and hitch in playing the video. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being part of 79 AIOC virtual conference.
Thank you.